All right, we are in Acts chapter 19 right now. In the middle of the chapter. So where we left off, last time we were in Acts, verse 10, Paul has been there for 2 years in Ephesus. And during that time, we've been seeing some extraordinary miracles going on. We remember earlier in chapter 19 where he, even cloths that had touched him were taken to people and they were getting healed, and just some spectacular things because Ephesus was a town run by magic, and God was using extraordinary miracles to kind of get their attention. We also saw some great missionary work going on as Paul was teaching in the school of Tyrannus. Obviously, a nickname his students gave him. He's the tyrant. But Paul was training disciples, and they were scattering out from there and starting churches all over Asia. So it reads there in Acts 19:10, the Jews and Greeks who lived in the whole province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. So there's spectacular stuff going on. And as we discussed last week, he also wrote 1 Corinthians during this 2-year time period when he's busy. Just as a reminder of a little bit of 1 Corinthians, chapter 4, verse 18, he wrote to him, because some of you have become arrogant, some of the Corinthians, as if I were not coming to you. But I will come to you very soon, if the Lord is willing, and then I will find out not only how these arrogant people are talking, but what power they have. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk, but of power. What do you prefer? Shall I come to you with a rod of discipline? Or shall I come in love and with a gentle spirit? Well, apparently they decided they wanted him to come with the rod of discipline. Because somewhere during this stay in Ephesus, Paul made a spot visit down to Corinth. And it was a painful visit. He mentions some things about it in his letter of 2 Corinthians, which was written after his visit. So apparently the church at Corinth had some mixed reactions to his letter, and so he went down to try and get things back together again. But it didn't go well. In 2 Corinthians 1, verse 15, he wrote, because I was confident of this, I wanted to visit you first so that you might benefit twice. I wanted to visit you on my way to Macedonia and come back to you from Macedonia and then to have you send me on my way. So his initial plan was he's going to go to Corinth first, then go and visit all the churches there in Macedonia and then come back. But chapter 2, verse 2 in 2 Corinthians, he says, so I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit. So he can't be talking about his first visit. So he made another visit after writing 1 Corinthians, and it didn't go well. We can only speculate exactly what happened, but if we pull some things out of his letter to 2 Corinthians, we can kind of get an idea of what happened in this painful visit. Throughout 2 Corinthians, Paul is defending his apostleship. And it appears that there were a lot of false teachers that are infiltrating the church and opponents of Paul, and they were questioning if they should listen to him or not. Is he really an apostle? And so he exposes these false teachers who he sarcastically calls super apostles. And some of the things that they were saying about him, he kind of hints at in his letter. First, his opposition was accusing Paul of being dishonest. We read in 2 Corinthians 7:2, Paul says, make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said before that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you. In other words, someone was saying Paul was exploiting the people in the church or corrupting them or doing something wrong. And so Paul is trying to defend himself. I haven't been dishonest. We have a sincere love for you. We kind of get the hint that the opposition was accusing Paul of being a coward. That when he writes his letters, they're hard and harsh. But when he's there in person, he's weak and contemptible. We read this in chapter 10 of 2 Corinthians, verse 1. It says, "By the humility and greatness of Christ I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold toward you when away." He's obviously quoting someone who accused him of that. He says it again in chapter 10, verse 9 and following. "I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and speaking amounts to nothing." Whereas the old King James, in person he is weak and contemptible, is what the language they use. Verse 11 says, "Some people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present." In other words, watch out. You think we're weak when we're present? Well, we're going to be just like we are in the letters if you keep this up. We also get the impression that the opposition personally attacked Paul himself when he was there on this visit. So when he was there in Corinth, these super apostles, they oppose Paul to his face. They criticize his ministry. They attack him personally. And it appears that the church either said nothing or they actually sided with the false teachers against Paul. Some of the hints of that, 2 Corinthians 6:11. "We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us." So apparently they weren't showing Paul the love that he has been showing them. Chapter 12, verse 11. "I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to those super apostles. Even though I am nothing, as far as they say, I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles." And so these false apostles were attacking him, and the church did not come to his defense. Chapter 13. "This will be my third visit to you." Okay, well, we've got his first visit when he showed up a couple chapters ago in Acts. Second visit is this painful visit, so Paul's on his way to make a third visit. He says, "Every matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses," quoting the law of Moses there. "I already gave you a warning when I was with you the second time, and I now repeat it while absent. On my return, I will not spare those who sinned earlier or any of the others, since you are demonstrating proof that Christ is speaking, or demanding proof that Christ is speaking through me." And so that second visit did not go well. And Paul returns back to Ephesus, and he's probably pretty depressed and not happy. And so what he does is he sends another letter off with Titus. In 2 Corinthians 2, 3, and 7, 8, he talks about his previous letter, and it's not 1 Corinthians. And so I can imagine, with the attitude he was probably in when he got back to Corinth, or Ephesus, that probably was not a nice letter. It was probably rather harsh and strict, and probably not inspired by the Holy Spirit, more by his attitude of what he had experienced. And so he writes off this letter, and he sends Titus with it back to Corinth, and waits for the response. So that's one thing that's happening during this time. Another thing that happens that Acts doesn't tell us about is Aquila and Priscilla, they leave Ephesus. Just recap, Aquila and Priscilla are a husband and wife team. They had lived in Rome, but in 49 or 50 A.D., they were expelled from Rome with all the Jews when Claudius ordered all the Jews to leave. We read about that in Acts 18:2 as well as Roman history. 50-51, Paul meets them in Corinth. They're tent makers just like he is, so he works with them as he spreads the gospel. We read that in Acts 18. When Paul leaves Corinth and goes to Ephesus, he takes Aquila and Priscilla with him, leaves them at Ephesus, and he goes back to Jerusalem and Antioch. And it's while that they are there in Ephesus that they teach Apollos and grow him in his faith. So when Paul returns in about a year or so, they're still there in 54, because 55, 56, when Paul writes 1 Corinthians, They're part of the greetings at the end of the letter. It says Aquila and Priscilla greet you. And so they're still there in Ephesus when he writes 1 Corinthians. However, a year or so later, 56, 57 AD, when Paul writes Romans, they are now in Rome. Because he says, greet Aquila and Priscilla in the church that is in their house. And so somewhere after the 1 Corinthians was written and before he writes Romans a year or two later, Aquila and Priscilla moved back to Rome. Now when you read the account of Acts in Ephesus, there's not a whole lot of turmoil going on, is there, until what we're going to get to tonight. There's, miracles and discipleship going on. But when we read the letters, his ministry in Ephesus was not all sunshine and roses. There's some serious stuff going on here. 1 Corinthians 15:32, he says, I fought wild beasts in Ephesus. I don't think he meant literal wild beasts. It's probably a figure of speech for the opposition that attacked him. It was fierce. It was like wild beasts. In Romans 16:4, he says, they, meaning Aquila and Priscilla, risked their lives for me. What was going on that they had to risk their lives? The biggest one, though, is in 2 Corinthians 1, starting at verse 8. Paul says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. And most of his time in Asia was spent in Ephesus. He says, we were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. But this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us. What is going on in Ephesus? Yeah, we've got all this great stuff going on, but we also have all sorts of attacks and trouble, and Paul is even despairing of life over what's going on. And so we didn't get those stories in Acts, as we've talked about in the past. Luke is selective in what he picks. He skips over months and years at a time with one sentence because of the theme he's trying to go with, which is the spread of the gospel. So something is going on here at Ephesus with Paul. In fact, some think that Paul might have actually spent some time in prison while he was in Ephesus. We don't read about that in Acts at all. In fact, the only time we hear about Paul in prison in Acts before he goes to Jerusalem is Philippi, with the earthquake that sets him free. But in his letters, 2 Corinthians 11:23, as he's defending himself against these super apostles, says, are we servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this. He's kind of listing his credentials. I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. Well, what other times was he in prison? In a lot of the places, he got ran out of town rather quickly. So it seems Ephesus would be one likely place where he'd have time to spend in prison. So maybe there was a prison sentence here. In Romans 16:7, in his greeting, says, greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. Well, where were they in prison? It wasn't Philippi, it was just Silas there. So possibly he was in prison sometime during this stretch in Ephesus. Can't prove that, but it seems a possibility. But let's jump back into Acts, because Paul is getting towards the end of his ministry here, and he has some plans that he is making. Verse 21 says, after all this had happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia and Achaia. And after I have been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. He's going to get to Rome eventually, but not quite the way he intended. He sent two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. So Paul is getting ready to go on his journey towards Jerusalem, revisiting churches. But before that happens, we get a riot in Ephesus. Now, just to refresh our memories, Ephesus was the center of the worship of Artemis, or Diana, Roman Diana, Greek Artemis. And the temple of of Artemis there in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This is someone's conception of what it might have looked like. People from all over the empire came to this temple. It was world famous, which makes it ironic, as we saw a couple times ago, that this is all that's left of that temple. Just that pole is all. That post is the only thing left, and usually it's underwater because this is a big marsh now. And so this beautiful temple that was one of the 7 wonders of the world is now just a post. But Artemis, the great mother goddess, queen of the world according to the Ephesians, was the primary, it was the religious heart of the city, and it was also the commercial heart of the city, this temple, because it served as the bank for the whole area. And so this is big business going on at this temple. And selling statues of Artemis to the tourists and worshipers who come from all over, you can imagine the money they were making. And so they have a problem with Paul. And so we read in Acts 19:23, about that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. There is Christianity being called the way again. And why is it called the way? More than likely? Yeah, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So, a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. So he called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." And so these silversmiths they're not happy. They're in a rage. Paul came in and now they're losing business. People aren't buying their statues of Artemis anymore because they've turned to Christ and rejected all of that. And so they're saying, we got to do something about this guy. So he calls the union meeting together. The guilds there in Ephesus were pretty much a lot like our trade unions today. And so he called them together and says, "What are we going to do about this? The gospel's cutting into our profits. We can't let Paul keep doing that. And besides, besides hitting our pocketbooks, this city, the whole economy is centered around this, and her reputation could, get spoiled. What? Are we really going to sit here and not defend our great goddess Artemis? Great goddess if you got to defend her. But we grew up with this. We got to stop Paul and get rid of him. And so they get whipped into a frenzy and they go running out into the streets. And we get a riot in the theater. It said when they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" And soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. This theater still is in pretty good shape today. At that time, it was at its height, it could hold 25,000 people. And it would be where they would go for plays and concerts and big public gatherings. So people were used to coming here to do things. The silversmiths, they had economic reasons to oppose the gospel. No, it was cutting into their bottom line. The Ephesian people, what kind of reasons did they have?
Financial.
Yeah. Now, they had more religious reasons to oppose the gospel. For generations, they had dedicated everything to the goddess Artemis or Diana. They weren't about to change that now, and so they all converge here in this theater and start this big riot. Which brings us to our first connection. Why do people oppose the gospel today? What are some reasons people reject the gospel?
They don't want to change.
Okay. Just like these people, they don't want to change. They don't want Jesus telling them what they can and can't do.
It goes against traditions that they were raised with, maybe.
Okay, yeah. People don't like to give up the things they're used to.
They can't see it, so they don't want to believe it.
Possible, yeah. I think the big one is, though, they don't want to give up control of their own life. No one can tell me what to do. In 2 Timothy, Paul will write much later, he kind of gives us a view of what people are like. And within this list we see why people reject the gospel. It said 2 Timothy chapter 3, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves." Selfishness is a big reason. "Lovers of money. Boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good." I always find it funny, you got all these, things that we would consider heinous problems: boasting, pride, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful. You think, what's that doing in the middle of this list? Well, in God's eyes, that's just as bad as the rest of them. It's showing your selfishness and inability to follow His direction. Treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That sounds like our society today, doesn't it? If it feels good, do it. And at least in their view, the things of God don't feel good. We know better. And then verse 5, "Having a form of godliness, but denying its power." What does that mean?
Being religious, but you're not changed by it. You just kind of go through the motions.
And we have a lot of people like that in our world today, don't we? You ask them, "Do you believe in God?" "Yeah, I believe in God." Doesn't change anything in their life. They hang on to their own idea of who God is. It's a form of godliness. Even a lot of people who come to church, they're depending on their church attendance to save them. They got a form of godliness, but they are not lovers of God. They're denying its power. Well, anyway, we got this riot going on. In 1930, I find it interesting, Paul wanted to appear before the crowd. But the disciples, I would add wisely, would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. Why would it be such a bad idea for Paul to go to the theater?
He could get slaughtered.
They're already worked up into a frenzy over their goddess. They have two of Paul's fellow workers already there as hostages, prisoners, victims. I don't know. This would put Paul in mortal danger. It's interesting that some of the officials are friends of Paul. You can see the influence he's been having. Even some of the rulers are telling him, "Hey, Paul, we like you. Don't go there." It kind of gives me the reminder. Sometimes we do face danger for the cause of Christ, don't we? But that doesn't mean we have to seek it out. If Paul went to the theater, he's putting himself in a dangerous situation he didn't have to put himself in. And sometimes in our lives, yes, when we stand up for Christ, there's danger will come, but we don't need to seek it out. Paul's presence there would have only made things worse. Verse 32, "The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another, and most of the people did not even know why they were there." Love that description. These guys are shouting for that. These guys are shouting something else, and somebody goes, "What's going on?" "Oh, they're shouting. I'll shout too." We just got copycat people going on here. Follow the leader, even if you don't know what's going on. Verse 33, "The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front and shouted instructions to him." This is a different Alexander than the silversmith. This is a Jewish leader. So I'm assuming they're probably trying to distance themselves from Paul and his group. They want people to know, this isn't us. We don't believe what Paul believed. We're not Jesus followers. Doesn't go too well for them either, though. 34, but when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So they want to listen. Well, here's a Jewish guy. He doesn't believe in our God either. Why do we want to listen to him? And so they shout him down. And can you imagine 2 hours of shouting and frenzy for their goddess there in Ephesus? I wonder if any of them got hoarse. Finally, verse 35, we see the city clerk, kind of like the mayor. He was one guy who kept all the records and the registrar. He was the accountant. He was the one who wrote and read all the laws to the people, probably in this theater. He finally shows up. It took him 2 hours to show up, maybe because his office was actually on the other end of the city, or maybe because he was just scared to go in there. It doesn't tell. But he finally gets in there, quieted the crowd, and gives 4 points why they need to stop this riot. Number 1, he says, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash." In other words, the reputation of the goddess Artemis is not in danger. You don't need to do this to defend her. Reminds us too, people trying to defend their false gods just shows how useless they really are. Point number 2, he says, "You have brought these men here," pointing to Paul's 2 companions, "though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess." So a second point, there's no crime committed by these guys. They didn't take anything out of the temple. They're not saying bad things about Artemis. They're sharing the gospel. Which, when you go down the line with what the gospel is all about, is going to say this is a false god. But, they're not causing problems. They're not criminals. Point 3, if then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open. And there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. So his third point was, the silversmiths and those who instigated this mob, their actions are illegal. If you got a problem, take it to the courts. Don't riot. Ephesus is a city of law and order. Not vigilantism and mob rule. And then his fourth point finally shut him down. It says, "As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there is no reason for it." After he had said this, he dismissed the assembly. His fourth point, hey, we're in danger that the Romans are going to come in and condemn us for this riot. They're going to send in their soldiers, and it's going to be a big mess. Heads are going to roll. And so finally, the crowd came to their senses and dispersed, and Paul sees this riot as a cue, time to leave Corinth. And so in 20 verse 1, when the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. And so Paul sets up the leadership there and takes north. Before we go into that, our next connection, we saw the impact Paul had on Corinth. He's got some of the leadership that are friends with him. He's hurting the business of these idol makers, impacting the entire region. How much impact does a church have on its community?
If it's a healthy praying church, it can have a huge impact.
Yeah. And to get more personal, and you don't need to answer this right now, but think about it. How much impact is our church having on our community? When people think of Shiloh, what do they think of? What's the first thing that comes to their mind? Are we having an impact that is changing things and making Christ known? Yeah. And that type of change and impact never ends. Church should always be striving to continue to make impacts into our community and world. Well, Paul heads north. Here's our map. His next stop that we know about is in Troas. That's about 150 miles north of Ephesus down there. We read about that. Chapter 20, verse 2, it says, he traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people. So he's stopping at the various churches that have been started, encouraging them on his way. In 2 Corinthians, we read about his stop in Troas. Verse 12, he says, now when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ and found that the Lord had opened a door for me, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia. Why is he looking for Titus? Remember, where had he sent Titus? He'd sent Titus with that letter back to Corinth. And he hasn't caught up with him yet. And so he's still wondering what is going on in Corinth. Are they still not happy with me? Is there still dissension going on? So he's looking for Titus, and Titus isn't showing up. And so you can imagine what that's doing to Paul's mind is, what is going on? He's worried about them. And so he continues on through Macedonia. So he crosses the straits there. Remember Philippi with the Philippian jailer and the earthquake that freed him from jail. You've got Thessalonica, which was always under heavy persecution. Berea. And so Paul's traveling through Greece here on his way back to Corinth to find out what is going on. And this would take a while. Luke says it in one little sentence there. But this trip probably took at least 2 to 6 months. I mean, it's if you made a straight shot, it would be 426 miles from Philippi to Corinth. But he's not making a straight shot. He's curving around all the different churches. And so this took time. And what was his purposes in stopping at all the churches along the way? Okay, he was encouraging them. And also, you remember at the end of 1 Corinthians, and it's going to be heavy in 2 Corinthians, he's collecting that offering for the saints in Jerusalem. The church there was always poor. They were being attacked from every side. And so he's collecting these funds to take back to Jerusalem to help the church there. And so that's the other part of his mission. And we'll read more about that when we hit 2 Corinthians. So he's traveling through Macedonia on his way to Corinth. And in 2 Corinthians 7:5, we finally get the good news. It says, for when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn. Conflicts on the outside, fears within. So even this trip was fraught with danger. Thessalonica, as we remember, was always under attack. And so he probably had persecution go on there. Fears within. What's going on at Corinth? Till finally, in verse 6, but God who comforts the downcast comforted us by the coming of Titus. Titus finally caught up with him. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort you had given him. He told us about your longing for me, your deep sorrow, your ardent concern for me, so that my joy was greater than ever. You can imagine Paul going, whew. Most of the problems in Corinth have been settled. They have good feelings toward me again. And so he is excited to get down there. But before he does, as soon as Titus shows up, he writes out a quick letter and sends it to him. And that is 2 Corinthians. And so that's what we're going to be next week. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians. Promise it won't be as long as last week. This one has a lot of things we can summarize. But so next week we will get to his letter he wrote after he found out the church was longing to see him again. He'll be there in Corinth for about 3 months before he heads back to Jerusalem. And during those 3 months he writes the book of Romans. And so we'll be hitting on Romans in a couple weeks as well. And then we'll finally get to Paul in Jerusalem and all the fun that happens there. And there's a lot of that's probably my favorite part of Paul's story is all the trials and everything in Jerusalem. So that's where we're headed.